Bright Duty. Every student matters.
One of the significant developments in the Constituent Assembly was the passing of the objective resolution. So, the most remarkable feature of the proceedings of the Assembly was the passing of resolution on aims and objectives moved by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru on December 13, 1946. So, this objective resolution and its passing in the Constituent Assembly in the year 1946 is considered as a very significant development in the Constituent Assembly. The resolution ensured that safeguards would be provided for minorities, backward and tribal areas, and the depressed classes. So, this resolution gave a promise or a safeguard to all the backward sections of the society that their interests and their needs will be taken care of by the newly formed Indian government. The resolution also stated that the Constitution must guarantee and secure to all the people of India justice, that is social, economic and political. So, all kind of justice, which included social, economic and political justice, was to be ensured to the citizens of India. And this objective resolution also ensured equality of status, of opportunity and equality before law to all its citizens, irrespective of their social background. And along with justice and equality, the third value which was promised to everyone was freedom, which included freedom of thought, expression, belief, faith, worship, vocation, association and action, which was to be subjected to law and public morality. So, as we just saw, the objective resolution is ensuring to its citizens majorly three main values, that is justice, equality and freedom, which then we see our constitution is also promising and ensuring to all the citizens of our country. And the resolution pronounced that this ancient land would attain its rightful and honored place in the world and make its full and willing contribution to the promotion of world peace and the welfare of mankind. So, in the resolution, the makers of our constitution are also ensuring that this ancient civilization which our country is, although it was under the foreign rule for a long period, but now when it is free, it will ensure that it will contribute at its fullest to the promotion of world peace and welfare of mankind. That was what the objective of the newly formed Indian nation was, to contribute to the world peace and harmony, to build up a world which is better, which is equal and which is free for everyone. And this resolution was passed by the Constituent Assembly in its second session, which met on 22nd January 1947. So, we know the first session of the Constitution happened in December 1946, and in the next session, which met on 22nd January 1947, this resolution was passed by the Constituent Assembly. So, after looking at objective resolution, now we come to the committees. So, we see that the Constituent Assembly had appointed a number of committees for its smooth working. The Constituent Assembly appointed a number of committees to deal with different aspects of new constitution and discuss the reports prepared by these committees. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru presented the report of the Union Power Committee in April 1947. So this was one of the committees appointed by the Constituent Assembly, that is Union Power Committee, and the report of this committee was presented by Nehru in the year 1947. So the interim report of the advisory committee on fundamental rights and minorities was laid before the assembly by Sardar Patel. So similar to the Union Power Committee, another committee was named the Advisory Committee on Fundamental Rights and Minorities, and the report of this committee was laid down by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. The Committee on the Union and Provincial Constitutions and the subcommittees on minorities, fundamental rights and tribal and excluded area, and of the committees on the Supreme Court presented their reports in the 4th session of the Assembly, which began on July 14, 1947, after the decision to partition had been taken. So here we have mentioned names of certain other committees like the Union and Provincial Constitutions. This was one of the committees which dealt with the constitutions of the Union and Provincial administration. And then there were subcommittees also which worked under this committee, and one of them was minorities and fundamental rights and tribal and excluded area. This was one of the subcommittees which was looking at the rights of the minorities and people belonging to the tribal and excluded area. And there was committees on the Supreme Court, and all these committees we see that they presented their report in the 4th session of the Constituent Assembly, which met on this date, that is July 1947, and this committee had met after the decision to partition was taken. And we now come to the drafting committee. So you have to remember that out of different committees which were appointed by the Constituent Assembly, drafting committee is the most significant and most important committee. So the reports of the committee provided the brick and mortar of the structure. So the reports of different committees and especially the drafting committee is said to have provided the brick and mortar. In other words, the building foundation or the bricks or the foundation on which the whole constitution stood. On August 29, 1947, the Constituent Assembly set up a drafting committee under the chairmanship of B.R. Ambedkar. So the Constituent Assembly had appointed the drafting committee in the year 1947, August 29th. And the chairman of this committee was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. On the basis of the reports of various committees of the Constituent Assembly, the drafting committee prepared draft constitution under the constant guidance of Pandit Nehru and Sardar Patel and submitted it to the Assembly on November 3, 1947, which was then published in the year 1948. So we see that the drafting committee took reports from various other committees and then prepared the draft of the constitution. That's why the name drafting committee comes, because it is preparing the draft of the constitution on the basis of the reports which they are getting from different committees and subcommittees. And this drafting committee had Dr. B.R. Ambedkar as its chairman. Along with Ambedkar, we also see that this drafting committee had constant guidance from Nehru and Patel. And this drafting committee submitted the draft which it had prepared on the date November 3rd, 1947. And the draft which was submitted by this drafting committee was published in February 1948. So, an important departure of the draft from the objective resolution was that while the later, that is the objective here, the latter refers to the objective resolution. While the objective resolution declared that residuary powers under the Union of India would vest in the states, that is the provinces. Here the state refers to different provinces which came under the central government. The Union was to exercise only enumerated powers. So, according to the objective resolution, states were to be given more power over the central government. But the draft proposed that the residuary powers should reside in the Union. So, for the drafting committee, more power were to be given to the Union and not to the state. But in the objective resolution which we had talked about, which was moved by Nehru, the proposal was to give states more power over Union or the central government. But when the draft was passed in 1948, we see that the Union was given more power over the states. So, this was the departure or the difference which the constitutional draft had with objective resolution. And this proposal was accepted by the Constituent Assembly. The draft which was put forward by the drafting committee was then accepted by the Constituent Assembly with all these changes which it had proposed. Now we come to the next topic, that is adoption and inauguration of the Constitution. So now the draft is already made on the basis of the reports which are provided by different committees, and it is also got published. Now we see how this Constitution is getting adopted and how the inauguration of the Constitution takes place. So the draft Constitution was published in the form of a book in 1948. So towards the end of 1947, the draft committee submits the draft of the Constitution, and this draft get published by 1948. So an 8-month interval was allowed for its discussion. After publication, we see that an 8-month period is given so that the clauses of this Constitution can be discussed all over the country. So no person or no individual is left aside. People of the country are now given an opportunity to discuss different clauses of the Constitution. And the Constituent Assembly also discussed it thoroughly, clause by clause. So during this interval or during this period, that is 8-month period after the publication of the Constitution, we see that the Constituent Assembly is discussing every clause one by one. In this, no fewer than 7,600 amendments were tabled. So, amendments meant certain additions or changes to the draft. That is what the term amendment stands for, certain additions or changes which are brought on the basis of discussions. So, 7,600 amendments were tabled and as many as 2,473 were actually discussed. Out of the 7,635 additions or changes proposed by different sections, we see that around 2,473 amendments were tabled or discussed in the Constituent Assembly. And the Constituent Assembly had held 11 sessions and took 2 years, 11 months and 8 days. So, to frame the Constitution of the Indian Republic. So, starting from 1946 to 1949, and we know it is in 1950, January 26, that the Constitution comes into force or comes into effect. So, before that, almost 3 years before that, the writing of the Constitution had begun with the formation of the Constituent Assembly. That is what we had seen, or that is what we had been discussing. So, the approx time period which it takes for India to frame its constitution is around 3 years. That is an approx time period. And if you want to know the exact days or the years in which the framing of the constitution took place, it is 2 years, 11 months and 8 days. So, you can imagine how long it took for our forefathers, for our leaders to sit down and to bring into focus the needs, the requirements of every section of the society and frame a constitution which ensured to its citizens equality, justice and freedom. These are the constitutional rights which our constitution is ensuring or promising every citizen of the nation. And we see that the 12th and the final session of the Constituent Assembly was held on January 24, 1950. So, this is the year in which, this is the date on which the last or the final session of the Constituent Assembly takes place. And then Dr. Rajendra Prasad was unanimously elected as the first President of Union of India. You know that Dr. Rajendra Prasad was the President of the Constituent Assembly, and soon after the drafting of the Constitution, he was elected as the first President of the Union of India. And the Constitution came into force on Republic Day, January 26, 1950. So, all these preparations which was going on, all the discussions and debates met its desired conclusion with the formation or the framing of the Constitution and its coming into force on the day January 26, 1950. And on the same day, Dr. Rajendra Prasad assumed the office of the President of Indian Republic, and he was appointed the President of Indian Union. So, after looking at different committees and the significance of the objective resolution, now we can have a look at the debates which are happening in the Constituent Assembly, which goes on to play a major role in shaping the Constitution the way which we have it today. So the first important thing is vision of the Constitution to be framed. The Constituent Assembly debates help us to understand the many conflicting views of those who took part in the discussions. So these debates help us understand what kind of different opinions were coming up in the Constituent Assembly. Because we had representatives from different sections of the society and they had different interests while participating in these committees, and our effort is to see how, when they came together, what kind of conflicts and what kind of differing opinions they had with each other. The members articulated many demands and invoked their ideals. At the time, members changed their ideas and the debates continued for about 3 years. So we had seen that it approximately took 3 years for our constitution to get framed. So this happens as a result of the unending debates and discussions which are going around in the Constituent Assembly, because we have to take care of different sections of the society and the interests of those sections are to be considered. So it is a very time taking and a long procedure, because members who came into the Constituent Assembly gave differing opinions, and while they participated in the debates, many times they brought in their opinions on certain things, changed and evolved. So that was also later on expressed in these assemblies. And the Constituent Assembly in all held 11 sessions. Totally, the Constituent Assembly had met 11 times, with sittings spread over 165 days from 9th December 1946 to 26 November 1949. So this is the time period in which the Indian Constitution is getting framed, with a lot of debate and discussion happening around each aspect of Indian society. In between the sessions, the work of revising and refining the drafts was taken up by various committees and subcommittees. So we saw total 11 sessions are taking place, and in between the session also the members of the committees are working hard on revising the draft and refining the drafts, so that the framing of the Constitution happens in the best way possible. In December 1946, the Constituent Assembly started its work when the British were still in India. So this is also significant. They are working when the work of the Constitution begins even before British had left India, because it's in the year 1946. We know the Britishers are still there in India, but the work of framing a constitution had begun with the formation of a Constituent Assembly. The interim administration headed by Jawaharlal Nehru was in place. So by this time, an interim administration. So this is something which is an administration set up in the intermediate time or the intermittent time of before the leaving of the British. So the government under Jawaharlal Nehru is already formed with certain kinds of power, but obviously it is not an autonomous body, because the Britishers are already there and they have not left yet. But still there are certain powers which this administration headed by Nehru has hold on. So it could, however, operate only under the direction of the Viceroy. So this interim administration could only work under the direction of the Viceroy, and this was one of the biggest limitations. This administration was not a autonomous body, and they had also to be guided by the government in London, or the instructions which were given by the British government in London were also to be paid attention to by this interim administration, which was headed by Nehru. At this time, a communist member of the assembly, Somnath Lahiri, exhorted or said that the members of the assembly to realize that it was British made and was working the British plans as the British should like to be worked out. So for Somnath Lahiri, the Constituent Assembly, which was set up in the year 1946, December 1946, was a body which was British made. He rejected its significance, saying that Indians had no power. Instead, all the decisions were taken by the British and was working the plans of British. It was serving the interest of the British. So, Somnath Lahiri, who is a Communist Party member, says that this whole constituent body or the Constituent Assembly is insignificant because it is serving the interest of the British government and not the common Indians. Now we move on to see how the public opinion influences the debates in the Constituent Assembly. We know there are selected members from the legislature and executive in the Constituent Assembly, but the public opinion is also of high regard in the making of the Constitution, and it is paid attention to by the members of the Constituent Assembly. So how this influence is taking place, or how the public is able to influence the framing of the Constitution. So Pandit Nehru admitted that nationalist leaders had wanted the formation of a different kind of Constituent Assembly. This administration headed by Nehru and the Constituent Assembly, we saw, had certain limitations. As the Communist Party member Somnath Lahiri had pointed out, it was run by the British, or the power was in the hands of the British, and the Constituent Assembly was not really serving the interests of the Indians because of this control of British. So even Nehru did not completely reject what Lahiri was saying, and he also admitted that the Constituent Assembly formed should have been of a different kind. It shouldn't have been under the power of the British. And Nehru emphasized that, so we are quoting him here, Nehru in the Constituent Assembly debate said, and I am quoting Nehru, quotes, "We have met here today because of the strength of the people behind us." So who are these people? Nehru is talking about the strength of the people who are behind us, and it is the common Indians, the poor and the Indians from different sections of the society. These are the people whom Nehru is referring to. And we shall go as far as the people behind us shall wish us to go. So he is crediting the common Indian with all kind of efforts being taken up by this body. He is saying that wherever we are, it is because of the support which we have got from common Indians. And where we are heading towards will also depend on the people who have chose us and who have given us this responsibility to frame a constitution for a free India. We should therefore keep in mind the passions that lie in the hearts of the masses. So, the passion that lies in the heart of the masses, that is again common Indian men and women, and try to fulfill them. So, the ultimate task of the Constituent Assembly and the makers of the Constitution is to serve the interests of common Indians, whom Nehru calls the masses. And he says one should know the passions that lie in the heart of masses of the Indian people and try to fulfill them. The people hoped that Constituent Assembly would express the aspirations of those like Swami Dayanand, Vivekanand and Jyotiba Phule, who had struggled for equality and justice. So, along with the desires of the common man, it was also important that there were a whole range of people like the socio-religious reform leaders whom you all have read about or studied about, and important or significant among them were people like Swami Dayanand, Vivekanand and Jyotiba Phule, who had fought against social injustice and evil practices which was prevalent in Indian tradition. So while framing the constitution, the Constituent Assembly had also taken into consideration these great men who had given importance to values like justice, freedom and equality for everyone. And the deliberations were reported in the newspapers and the proposals were publicly debated. So along with the debates which was going on in the Constituent Assembly, the decisions which were made in the assembly was also reported in newspaper. So this is how the common people got to know about what was going on in the Constituent Assembly. And the proposals which were made were also publicly debated. The common people who read these newspapers and got to know about the discussions also participated in this debate on the way our constitution should be framed and what priorities should it give. So, in order to create a sense of collective participation, the public was also asked for submissions. So, this is most important. The public also comes into play here. That is, through newspapers and other reports, the public is given. So, through newspapers and other reports, the public is kept informed about the proceedings of the Constituent Assembly, and even they are asked for submitting certain suggestions if they want to the Constituent Assembly. Now we move on to see the Indian participation in the legislature. We have now looked at how the Indian common men and women are also given a chance to give their submissions and make their opinions heard in the debates and discussions which are going in the Constituent Assembly. And now we move on to see what was the participation of Indians in the legislature during the colonial rule. Post-colonial rule, obviously it is Indians who are entrusted with the task of legislature, executive and judiciary. But how Indians acquired the power and the right to have legislature and have the power over legislature, we now look at. The British government had introduced a series of acts like the Acts of 1909. So we know, you must have all heard of this act, which is termed the Act of 1909, which was the Morley-Minto Reform. This Act of 1909 is termed the Morley-Minto Reforms, and the 1919 Act, also called Montagu-Chelmsford Reform, and the 1935 Act, which was also called the Government of India Act 1935. So all these acts passed under the colonial power was meant to give certain kind of powers to the Indian section. So it had gradually enlarged the scope for Indian participation in the provincial legislatures. So these acts were meant to gradually increase the powers which Indians had in the provincial legislature. That is the law making body. Legislature meant the law making body, and here it referred to the law making body in the provinces. And as a result of elections held in 1937 under the Act of 1935, that is Government of India Act 1935, the Congress formed ministries in 8 out of 11 provinces. So in this 1937 election, Congress won over 8 seats out of 11 seats in the provincial sector. But the Act of 1935 had given the right to vote to no more than 10 to 15% of the adult population. So this was the biggest limitation which this act had, that was, it did not support a universal adult franchise. Instead, it gave voting rights to only 10 to 15% of the adult population. Unlike what we now have in the post-independent India, where every citizen above the age of 18 is eligible to vote, it wasn't there in this 1935 Act. Only 10 to 15% had the right to vote, and this was one of the biggest limitations of this Act and this provision, because it did not allow adult franchise. So this is how this whole So now we move on to see the need of defining rights. The question arose in the assembly that should the oppressed groups have any special rights, what rights the minorities should have. So another important question, we talked about different debates and discussions which are going in and around the Constituent Assembly. And we also saw how when the Constituent Assembly is formed in the year 1946, certain leaders feel that this is a body without any power because the British is controlling it. And we quoted Somnath Lahiri, who was a communist member, who says that this is a committee which is headed by the British and it is insignificant. And then we saw how Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru responds to this by saying the Constituent Assembly and its efforts are meant to meet the needs of the Indian masses and to fulfill their desires and to ensure them a life of freedom, equality and justice. And then we saw how the legislature and the legislative powers were gradually given to the Indians through a series of acts like 1909, 1919 and 1935. And from there, now we move on to see certain discussions centered around rights of different sections of the society. The question arose in the assembly that should the oppressed groups have any special rights. So the oppressed sections refer to the sections in the lowest strata of our society, especially the lower caste and the lower class sections. And the other question which came up is, what rights should the minorities have? So both the oppressed sections and the minorities issues are taken up in the Constituent Assembly. So the different groups, we know the Constituent Assembly consists of different members from different sections of the society, and as a result the different groups expressed their will in different ways and made different demands. So it is obvious that when we have people representing different sections, their interests will also be different and their opinions will also vary. So the conflicting views had to be debated and reconciled before a consensus could be reached. So when different people gave their opinions, it was important that they were to be given a space and a kind of voice so that they could table or they could give their opinions, and then which could then shape a discussion. And as a result, a consensus could be reached. So when the question of minorities came up, the important issue which was of concern was whether there was a need for a separate electorate or a joint electorate would do. This was an issue which was this is an issue which has a heated debate in the Constituent Assembly on the question of separate electorate for the minorities. So B. Pokar Bahadur, a member from Madras, he was one of the members from Madras who was there in the Constituent Assembly, made a powerful plea for continuing separate electorate. So this Pokar Bahadur, member of Constituent Assembly, makes this plea or request that there should be separate electorates. A continuation of separate electorates. We know during the British period, the Muslims are given separate electorate provision, and B. Pokar Bahadur is requesting that this provision of separate electorate should continue. And he argued that minorities existed in India and they could not be washed away. So this minority question is to be addressed by the Constituent Assembly and they cannot turn their face from this question, is what B. Pokar Bahadur is saying. So if the minorities were to be allowed in peace and harmony, they should be well represented within the political system. So if the minorities were to be allowed to live in peace and harmony, B. Pokar Bahadur says that they should be well represented in the political system. So this representation question is very important, that every community should have their representatives in the legislature and executive, so that whatever their interests are and whatever their needs are, they are properly addressed. So B. Poker Bahadur is saying that in order for proper representation, this separate electorate is very important. But we also see that the demand for separate electorate enraged some of the nationalist leaders. They held that the British introduced separate electorate to divide the people. So we know Britishers ruled in India using the principle divide and rule. So dividing people on the basis of religion and making communal divisions was something which Britishers had always used as a tool to sustain their power. And so those people who objected the demand for separate electorate made this claim that it will divide the people, or it will divide Indians into different communities. And R.V. Dhulekar told B. Poker Bahadur that with the help of it, the British misguided the people. So R.V. Dhulekar is trying to convince Poker Bahadur that it was Britishers who had introduced this separate electorate, which was that the elections will be held at different points for different communities. So when the national election is taking place, the Muslims of the nation would not be voting. They will have a separate election where their representatives will be chosen to power. So this was first met by the Britishers. When the Muslim League had raised this issue, separate electorate provision was given to Indian Muslims by the British, and during the framing of the constitution, this question is coming up again, and as we saw, people like Poker Bahadur is raising this demand, and we see that another section in the Constituent Assembly is making objections. They are saying that this will divide our community and as a result divide our nation. Separate electorate was a poison that has entered the body politic of country, declared Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. So we see that even Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel is totally against the provision of a separate electorate, and he says it is the poison that has entered the body politic of the country which will destroy our country. Behind all these arguments against separate electorate was the concern with making of a unified nation state. So for all those who opposed this idea of a separate electorate, their aim was to build up a unified nation state where Indians could come alongside each other and stand united. For the political unity of the country, every individual had to be molded into a citizen of a state. Each group had to be assimilated with the nation. So, for those who opposed the demand for separate electorate, they felt that political unity of the country will only happen if the individuals were molded into citizens. So more than being a Hindu, Muslim or a Christian, individuals were to be taught and trained in a way that they feel that they are Indians first and their religion comes next. And then each group had to be assimilated or accepted into the nation. All the Muslims did not support the demand for separate electorates. So here, once again, we must remind ourselves that this is not a demand which all the Muslims are making. The separate electorate, certain sections within the Muslim community are opposing this demand for the separate electorate, and one of the examples is Begum Afzal Rasool, who felt that separate electorate were self-destructive since they isolated the minorities from the majority. So people like Begum Afzal Rasool is opposing this demand, saying that this will isolate the minorities from the majority and result in division of the country. So we saw how the demands of the oppressed sections, their rights, and especially the demands coming from the minority, and what kind of debates are then going around in the Constituent Assembly. And we now come to the subject on resolutions, and how there comes a feeling that only resolutions will not do much. So the members of the assembly, that is the Constituent Assembly, urged that only objective resolution would not do much. So the objective resolution we had mentioned about, which was moved in the Constituent Assembly by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru in the year 1946, and now discussions are also coming in the Constituent Assembly on resolutions and its significance. So it is said that it was essential that conditions must be created where constitutionally enshrined rights could be effectively enjoyed. So a resolution will not do everything. The resolution is ensuring that no matter whatever background an Indian belongs to, he or she will be ensured all kinds of rights. But the people in the Constituent Assembly are raising this issue that merely saying something or passing a resolution will not help. Instead, an effective condition has to be created where this constitutionally enshrined rights are given, or people can exercise those rights. The representative of the tribals, Jaipal Singh, so he is one of the members in the Constituent Assembly who is representing the tribal sections of the society, had welcomed the objective resolution moved by Nehru, and Jaipal Singh was not asking for separate electorate for the tribals, but he said that reservation of seats in the legislature was essential to allow the tribals to represent themselves. So here, unlike the Muslim minority sections who are asking for a separate electorate, the tribal representative Jaipal Singh is not demanding a separate electorate, but he demands reservation of seats for the tribals so that a special attention is given to meet their needs, because it is one of the most oppressed and downtrodden section of the society. So it is important that they are given certain assistance so that their representatives can come into power and thereby address their problems in a most effective way. And from tribals, we look at depressed classes who have been suppressed for thousands of years. So in that, tribals also belong to the depressed section of our society, along with people from the lowest strata and the lowest class and caste sections. So the Constituent Assembly had to decide what kind of protection was the depressed caste to be provided. So the important question which the Constituent Assembly had to address was what kind of protection had to be given to the depressed caste. And it was realized that the problem of untouchability, which you know is a social evil practiced in Indian society. So the problem of untouchability could not be resolved through protection and safeguards alone. So giving the depressed sections certain rights and ensuring it will not do enough or will not be enough to completely eradicate or abolish practices like untouchability. This was what came up as a result of the debates which was going around on the question of protection of the depressed classes. A member from Madras named Nagappa pointed out that numerically depressed classes formed between 20 and 25% of the total population of the country. So, from the Madras Presidency, there was this member whose name was Nagappa, and he pointed out depressed classes were around 20 to 25% of the total population, and he said they are not suffering because of the numerical insignificance. That is, in numbers, they are not that very few. 25% means it's a large society. But the problems they were facing was because they had no access to education and no share in the administration. So according to Nagappa, the sufferings of the depressed classes was mainly because of lack of education and no share in the administration. So both these issues were to be addressed most efficiently, and only if these problems are solved, then the depressed classes will have proper representation. That is what Nagappa pointed out, who was a member from the Madras region and a member of the Constituent Assembly. And while discussing issues of the depressed classes, he pointed out that these are the problems which the depressed classes mainly face. So, K.J. Khanderkar, a member of the Central Province. So, the Central Province had these areas of Maharashtra, which is today's Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh, and areas of Chhattisgarh. These are the geographical areas which was Central Province, or which the Central Provinces consisted of. And K.J. Khanderkar said that the depressed classes have been suppressed for thousands of years to such an extent that neither our minds nor our bodies and now even our hearts work, nor we are able to march forward. So this is what Khanderkar is saying, that due to thousands of years of suppression and cruel treatment, our minds have stopped working, our bodies have stopped working, and now even our hearts have stopped working. So this is the sorry state of people of this community. And K.J. Khanderkar is pointing out or throwing light on the worst conditions in which people of the depressed classes survive. And after seeing the violence of partition, B.R. Ambedkar too no longer favored separate electorate. So similar to other representatives like Nagappa of the tribal group and other leaders of the depressed class, we see that Ambedkar too, when he saw that what separate electorate had done to the Muslim community and how the separate electorate system had played a major role in partitioning and dividing our country, Ambedkar decided that this separate electorate for Dalits is not going to be of much help. Instead, it will only result in the division of the country. So, Ambedkar, who had once raised this demand for separate electorate of Dalits, did not ask for it while the constitution was getting framed. Instead, he chose not to demand for a separate electorate. The Constituent Assembly finally recommended that untouchability should be abolished. So, the abolition of the Devil Act or the evil practice of untouchability gets banned in the Constituent Assembly by passing of certain laws which abolished or banned practices of untouchability and made it a punishable offence. If anybody did practice such evil acts like untouchability, they were to be subjected to punishment, and it was illegal. Hindu temples be thrown open to all castes. So, the Constituent Assembly also recommended that the Hindu temples, which initially in these certain temples, the lower caste people were not allowed to enter in, and in certain temples, women were not allowed to enter in. So, in these temples, the Constituent Assembly demanded that it should be thrown open to all castes, and seats in legislatures and government jobs be reserved for the lower caste. And so, along with opening of temple for all sections, the seats in legislatures and government jobs were also to be reserved for the lower caste, because this was a section who were prosecuted and suppressed for a long time by the elite sections of the society. So, it was the time to consider their demands and to give them a special assistance so that the mistakes which the elites had committed to the lower sections could now be absolved. So, the special attention and care was to be given for bringing the lower caste into the forefront and for giving them proper representation.